When I chose the aspirations for the Sims in the Asylum, I did it based on their personality and what seemed like the most suitable for them, and then once I started planning how I was going to play the Asylum challenge, I realised I would have to complete their aspirations in a certain order, because some of them had aspirations that required them to be in a household with other Sims. And just by chance, the way that's worked out, as Michelle completes her aspiration and leaves the asylum, we're in a situation where I have all 4 of the male Sims still remaining, and then I have Susan. Which is not, so strange, but interesting that Susan got her way and got to be alone with all the men, just the way she likes it. It's funny how often this playthrough is actually reflecting reality, although any characters in this playthrough are purely fictional, and any resemblance they bear to any real-life people is purely coincidental. Another day in the asylum, and more of Michelle just enjoying the smell of her own farts. She is still attempting to knit 10 out of 10 excellent items, and progress is still reasonably slow despite the fact that she has all these boosts to help her be inspired. However, as Michelle has now maxed the knitting skill, progress is improving slightly, mainly because Michelle is knitting things faster, but finally she has reached 7 out of 10, with just 3 more to go, and hopefully with her maxed knitting skill, the next 3 things she produces will actually be of excellent quality. After still yet more time of producing yet more of those pink substandard beanies with the weird red scar across their face, Michelle did however eventually manage to knit 10 out of 10 excellent beanies, thus completing that milestone of her aspiration, taking her into the 4th and final milestone. She had already checked off one part of the final milestone, in that she had maxed her knitting skill, and the next part was that she would have to teach someone to knit. The best bet was to go with someone who Michelle had a good relationship with, and that person happened to be Andy, although Andy wasn't particularly a happy person to communicate with. He was at least moderately intelligent and capable of concentrating on things that weren't particularly his day job, so he seemed like a good bet for Michelle to teach to knit. When Andy acquired the knitting skill, Michelle felt confident that progress would go well. Now that he's acquired the knitting skill, surely that means he's learned how to knit and her job is done. But apparently not, because Andy is the sort of person who needs to drag everything out. And so he reached skill level 2, and still he was asking lots of questions, and still Michelle had to sit there and just endure. Andy reached knitting skill level 3, and still didn't consider himself to have learned how to knit. Andy reached knitting skill level 4, and still he was asking questions, and still Michelle had to sit as patiently as she possibly could and wait it out. It was very difficult for her holding in her farts for that length of time, but finally Andy said he felt he'd got the hang of it, and so Michelle was able to check off that part of her aspiration. Now there were just 2 steps left to complete her aspiration and to leave the asylum. That was to donate 5 items to charity and to knit 5 items to legendary skill level. And given that it had taken Michelle some time to reach excellent level on 10 items, getting 5 items to legendary level was going to take some amount of time, unfortunately. However, as Michelle still had an inventory full of beanies, she had been able to very quickly check off donating 5 to charity, and it gave her a fuzzy heart moodlet, which helped with her inspiration and helped her working towards making those legendary items. In fact, it didn't take Michelle long to get 3 out of the 5 legendary items knitted, and so she continued working away with just 2 more to do. Unfortunately, Michelle was still producing some of those substandard beanies, and unfortunately that meant progress was slow. On the plus side, it did mean that she was selling more through Plopsy and raising more funds which she would need when she left the asylum. Producing substandard items and dragging things out longer than was necessary was unfortunately also something that Michelle was rather good at. Despite being stressed about a midlife crisis that was pending and festering bitterness towards various people in the asylum, Michelle did finally manage to reach 4 out of 5 legendary items knitted, with just one more to go. So very close to reaching her goal of leaving the asylum. It had taken her so long, the seasons had changed, and we were now into springtime. But maybe with a bit of help from some, potion, Michelle could reach that goal and make her escape. And as she finally felt very inspired, after a little cowpoke dancing, Michelle decided to sit down and make that attempt at knitting that one last legendary item. And despite the fact that Michelle had to contend with Stuart dancing rather terribly directly in front of her as she tried to knit that one last item, she somehow managed to remain very inspired and somehow managed to knit one more legendary item, completing her aspiration at last. And with that, Michelle had become Lady of the Knits. It had been a long journey, but she had finally completed every step of the aspiration, and now there was just one thing left to do, and that was to leave the asylum, to finally make her escape and leave behind the remaining 5 members of the asylum. And as Michelle takes her leave, whose story will we tell next? It's Glenn's story. The next story we will be telling will be the story of Glenn Green, in completing his nectar-making aspiration. Glenn is evil and sceptical, and generally just quite an unpleasant person to be around. And for the next few episodes of this series, he will be the focus, unfortunately. At least Andy's enjoying watching him fall on his rear end in his nectar. Until next time, thanks for watching.
Hey.
New personality trait genius for Elgers. No, Elgers wishes, but no, absolutely not.